Today we are delighted that we have Jonathan Gil Harris as our speaker and Sambudha Sen as the chair. Sambudha Sen is Professor of English at the University of Delhi. His books include London, Radical Expression and the Making of Dickensian Aesthetic, and with four others, Khaki Shorts and Saffron Flags. His essays on the print culture of 19th century Britain have appeared in journals like Representations, English Literary History and 19th century literature. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that.
It's a great pleasure actually for me to be able to introduce my dear friend, Professor Jonathan Gil Harris. Gil has had an extremely distinguished academic career. He did his PhD in the University of Sussex when the English department in that university was, without exaggeration, the very best in the world. It was the department where many of the themes that we work with now were being discovered, articulated. Homi Baba was writing on post-colonialism. Gil's PhD supervisor, Jonathan Dollymore, was working on sexual dissidence and cultural materialism. And you can see that the work that Gil did subsequently reflects all those extremely groundbreaking impulses. He's worked on topics that would be unimaginable 20 or 30 years ago on the circulation of capital and disease and the way that this affects the work of Shakespeare on abstract issues like time in Shakespeare, critical theory in Shakespeare. Each of these books, I think there are four of them, have been published by some of the finest university presses in the United States and in England. And that actually reminds us that Gil, apart from being an extremely easy to get along person, very funny person, is also a major scholar of early modern Europe. But the thing that is really extremely, I admire most about Gil is that he abandoned, a well-established career to do something that entails a fair amount of risk. Actually, a fair amount of risk. He began researching the lives of relatively a group of relatively poor Europeans who either moved on their own accord or were forced to move and live in the subcontinent. It's a very difficult project because the colonial archives don't register their presence or register their presence only minimally. I can't think of many histories that deal with a subaltern European population in the 16th and 17th century. So there's very little to go by. But the most daring move that Gil has made, and you'll see the effects of that move in today's lecture, is this. He discovered an utterly obvious but very difficult to document parallel between his own situation and the situation of these early migrants. And that parallel is that migration works effects on your body. It transmutes your body in many ways, and it's by trying to recover the way that happens in his own personal experience that Gil then began to enter imaginatively into lives that we would have lost really had it not been for this great attempt at recovery. So that's what it is going to be, this lecture. Gil, please.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sambudha, and thank you, Rizio, too, for inviting me to do this. And thank you, all of you, for coming out tonight and submitting your bodies to the Siberian chill of the IHC Gulma Gulmohar Hall. So I'm going to be talking about the past, and that may seem a little bit anomalous in a series that is expressly devoted to considering issues in the present. But I am using the past as a sounding board to raise questions that should impact on us now. And as Sambudha has mentioned, I'm particularly interested in what is, I think, a more or less invisible phenomenon. And that is a phenomenon that dates back to what is known as the medieval Mughal period. It long predates British colonialism, when a number of migrants, mostly European, came to India and stayed, and to lesser and greater extents, became Indian. In other words, they not only made their homes in India, but they, to all intents and purposes, to outsiders, became legible as Indian. And this in turn raises the question, what do we really mean when we talk about foreigners and Indians? More precisely, what does it mean to be authentically Indian? Is there such a thing as authentic Indianness? And in this talk, the question will hover over the first 3/4 of the talk, but in the last section I'm going to address it full on. But I'm going to be thinking about the question of authentic Indianness through the prism of the word farangi. And I think by paying attention to that word, its history, its diverse uses, we can, if not answer the question of what it means to be authentically Indian, then at least reframe it in an interesting way. And I always think the objective is not to answer our questions, but to find more intelligent ways of asking them again. So I hope that's what I'm going to be able to do today. This particular question, what it means to be authentically Indian before the time of British colonialism, and what it means for a migrant to become Indian before the time of British colonialism, is of particular interest to me as a migrant to India from another country that has experienced British colonialism, New Zealand. So as you'll see, there is quite a bit of me in this talk. And I apologize in advance for bringing my own dirty laundry to wash here. But I hope that it's laundry that at times you'll find diverting, interesting, and provocative. So, as you'll see, the title of my talk is The First Firangis. It's subtitled Becoming Indian, or A Tale of Two Bandits. So, here goes. 28th of June, 1656. Haryana. Two bandits accost a European boy. Just another instance of a foreigner about to be robbed by Indians? Maybe, or maybe not. The bandits have encountered the boy at the Hodal Sarai, some 90 kilometers short of Delhi on the Imperial Highway from Agra. The boy wears a sad expression. He keeps casting anxious glances at his luggage, which is far bulkier than what we might expect of someone traveling alone. He's been in Hindustan for just a few months, and he's in something of a pickle. His name is Niccolo Manucci. Originally from Venice, he's the servant of an English ambassador who journeyed to Hindustan in the hope of meeting the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan. 3 days after leaving Agra, without warning, the ambassador keeled over and died. In the 8 days since then, young Manucci has had to fend for himself in unfamiliar and dangerous terrain. His wits have been expended largely on protecting his late master's belongings, which he can't carry alone. In some, Manucci is stranded, unable to advance to Delhi or to return to Agra. The two bandits smell Manucci's vulnerability. Dressed in Mughal clothing, they introduce themselves to him as captains in the army of Shah Jahan. One of them explains they have instructions from the emperor to confiscate the property of the ambassador, which has now lapsed to the crown. Minucci asks to see official documentation authorizing the confiscation, but none is forthcoming. He accuses the men of using Shah Jahan's name as a ruse with which to steal other people's goods. The bandits start laughing like a pair of guffawing Bollywood villains. Think Gilbert Singh and his sidekick Samba in Sholay. Predictably, they proceed to rob Minucci of all his late master's effects. But here's the rub. These two Indian bandits weren't exactly Indian. Writing about the incident 50 years later, Minucci explains that this Mughal-era Gilbert Singh and Samba were in fact two Englishmen named Thomas Roach and Raven Simmet. Forget Sholay. The bandits, it seems, were 17th century predecessors of Michael Caine's con artist character in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. Expatriate Englishmen in a foreign country preying on other unsuspecting travellers through their skills of deception. Minucci, in the account he wrote 50 years later, damns the pair as two English impostors. But what exercises him is less their Indian disguise than their fraudulence in claiming to act with the authority of the great Mughal. In other words, he's not at all puzzled or surprised that these two Indian people turn out to be English. And that itself should give us some pause. That this was, in fact, a more widespread phenomenon than we would expect it to be. That this young 15-year-old in Hindustan is not at all surprised to find out that an Indian is in fact English. What bothers him is the deception that they would take Shah Jahan's name to authorize an act of robbery. And that's because Roach and Simmet had been truthful about one thing. They were indeed servants of Shah Jahan, part of a ragtag group of foreigners that the emperor retained as mercenaries. Upon reaching the Mughal court in Delhi, Minucci lodged an official complaint against the emperor's wayward employees who were located and duly punished. Roach and Simmet's story has haunted me for some time now. It's altogether different from the standard narrative about the British presence in India, a narrative of Angrezi cultural, linguistic, racial supremacy, and of Indian oppression. Instead, Minucci presents us with the unexpected spectacle of two presumably poor Englishmen who were servants, if rather badly behaved ones, of the great Mughal. Great Mughal, sitting on the peacock throne. I'm fascinated as much by what Minucci's story leaves out as by what it includes. These are the questions he doesn't answer in his account. How had Roach and Simmet come to be in Hindustan? What drove them to seek service with Shah Jahan? If they wore desi clothes, what other aspects of Mughal Hindustani culture had they assumed? Did they eat English food or Mughalai khana? When speaking with the Italian Minucci, did they resort to a European tongue, to the local Hindavi dialects of the north, or to Persian, the language of the Mughal court, in which Minucci was already partly fluent, having spent some years in Iran? And what happened after their punishment? Did they remain in India? And if so, did they have Indian partners and even children? In short, to what extent did Roach and Simmet become Indian? Both Minucci and the historical record are silent on all these questions. Nothing Roach and Simmet may have written, letters, financial accounts, travel narratives, last wills and testaments, survive. For all we know, neither man was even literate. And there's nothing about them in either Indian or English 17th century records, save for one passing mention of their names in an East India Company document that lists Englishmen who'd found employment in the service of the Mughals. Yet Minucci's own life, as documented in his Storia do Mogor, the multilingual account of Mughal history that he wrote many years after the incident at the Hod al-Sarai, holds up a mirror to what the two bandits may have experienced in Hindustan. For Minucci was himself a foreigner from a very poor background who, after journeying to Surat, spent the rest of his life, some 6 decades, wearing Indian clothes as you can see here, serving Indian masters, fighting in Indian armies, learning Indian languages, performing Indian rituals, acquiring Indian knowledge, eating Indian food, making Indian friends and enemies, and marrying an Indian-born wife. He also practiced Indian medicine, becoming a Tamil-style Siddha Vaidya in Farangi, Malay, just outside Madras. The more I scoured the archives, the more I came to realize that Roach, Simmet, and Minucci were just three of many poor people from diverse parts of the world: Italy, England, Portugal, France, Ethiopia, Armenia, Persia, China, who migrated to India in the 16th and 17th centuries, and, to lesser and greater extents, became Indian. Readers of William Dalrymple's magnificent book, White Mughals, might regard the two bandits as instances of a familiar phenomenon. Dalrymple writes of British men in India who during late 18th and early 19th century, the late 18th and early 19th centuries, married Indian women, assumed local dress and customs, and had mixed race offspring. But there's a significant difference between the stories of Roach and Simmet and the lives of these later British men. As Dalrymple's title makes clear, White Mughals deals with powerful people. Most came from privileged backgrounds. Like the Mughals they emulated, they also assumed positions of privilege once in India. The East India Company resident of Hyderabad, for instance, or high officers in the British military. Their embrace of Indian culture was enabled but also circumscribed by the machinery of 19th century British colonialism. For all its seeming subversiveness, becoming Indian, in their cases, arguably furthered British power. By contrast, most foreign migrants to India in the centuries before the British White Mughals came not to conquer and command, but with much humbler ambitions, to escape poverty and persecution. Some were economic refugees, some were criminals, some were religious dissidents, some were even what we might call sexual dissidents. And some had no choice at all in the matter of their migration, having arrived in India as slaves, indentured servants, or possessions of their lords, masters, fathers, and husbands. To become an Indian in such circumstances entailed an altogether different calculus of power from that which shaped the lives of the White Mughals. This difference is partly due to the different delivery systems that brought migrants to the subcontinent before the age of British colonialism. In the 18th century, the British White Mughals reached India via a sea route that had become a major artery of European global domination. Vasco da Gama's, quote, discovery of the passage to India via the Cape of Good Hope had provided European travellers to India with an alternative to the slower and much more vexed overland route through the Ottoman and Safavid Persian empires. With heavily armed ships, European trading companies and their state sponsors, Portuguese, English, French, Dutch, even Danish, could now travel directly to and dominate the subcontinent. By the 18th century, European migrants to India arriving via the sea route tended to be absorbed into colonial systems designed to support and empower them. At the time of the White Mughals, the British Raj may have technically been more than half a century away. It would be formally instituted only in 1858, when the East India Company administered territories were handed over to the Crown after the 1857 events. Yet in the century prior, the company had already constructed a formidable political and military as well as mercantile machine throughout South Asia, having morphed from a mere joint stock trading company into a global imperial power. This machine did not yet exist in the 16th and 17th centuries. And this is a historical fact, but it's worth repeating it, simply because I've noticed an overwhelming tendency to read history proleptically through the lens of colonialism backwards, and assume as a result that any European who was in India prior to the age of British colonialism must have been a proto-colonialist. And this is simply not the case. The machinery of colonialism may have had incipient forms, in the time I'm speaking about. But these forms were eclipsed by other networks of globalization in which European nations were not yet at the center. And it's important to remember here that countries like England were at this time basically provincial backwaters economically and in terms of their global connections. Global economic power at this point was still concentrated in Asian empires, Ottoman Turkey, Safavid Persia, Mughal Hindustan, Ming, and then Qing China. It was also concentrated in the diverse trading networks that linked these empires to the Spice Islands, Africa, Arabia, and Europe. So this was very much an Asian-centered time, economically, politically, and socially. Unlike the later delivery systems blazed by the European drive to acquire Asian riches with a minimum of interruption and a maximum of firepower, these networks entailed completely different modes of contact between peoples. The main routes to India, the overland Silk Road, the blue ways of the Arabian Sea, the interlinked cluster of trading ports throughout Southeast Asia, the Spice Islands, and the Bay of Bengal, each traced complex multicultural trajectories. To journey on them required more patience, more linguistic proficiency, more tarrying in cosmopolitan way stations. Merchants had plied these paths for centuries, and in their caravans, dhows, and junks travelled other migrants, some of them voluntary, some of them coerced. These migrants had often left behind bad situations in their countries of birth, and they had no intention, let alone hope, of returning. When they arrived in the subcontinent, they stayed, and they became Indian. What was to become the major arteries sustaining European colonial supremacy in the subcontinent, the sea route via the Cape of Good Hope, dispatched 16th and 17th century migrants to a very different India from that in which the white Mughals would live 2 centuries later. It was an India in which the chief powers were still Asian rather than European. And I say Asian, not Indian, because the chief powers in the subcontinent at this time consisted of many foreign elites and dynasties. The Mughals in the north, the Deccan Sultanates across the middle band of the subcontinent were ruled largely by Persian and Turkish elites. Now, the Portuguese may have militarized the East African coast and the Arabian Sea, wresting control of the old trade routes from the Arabs and other local merchants. But outside Goa and the other tiny possessions of the Portuguese Estado da India, you can see Goa is barely a spot there. And there are a few other spots on this map which are Portuguese possessions. But the large powers here are the Mughal Empire in the north, the Deccan Sultanates, the Kingdom of Vijayanagar, or the Vijayanagar Empire in the south. So the subcontinent remained under the control of powerful Muslim and Hindu rulers. The glamour of such power is partly why Goa was not the final Indian destination for many Europeans who migrated there. Like Roach and Simmet, a number of less well-off Portuguese who made landfall in Goa proceeded to find reasonably well-remunerated positions as mercenaries and low-level court employees in the service of Indian masters elsewhere in the subcontinent. Let me just give you 2 examples. Sancho Perez, who came to Goa in the 1530s, fled to the Sultanate of Ahmednagar following a charge of murder. Once he arrived in Ahmednagar, he converted to Islam, and he found service first as a bombardier and later as captain of the Ahmednagar cavalry. Quite a high rank, in other words. In fact, he came to be the favorite of the Sultan of Ahmednagar, Nizam Shah, who called him Farangi Khan, foreign lord. Perez Farangi Khan was not a lone figure. The Ahmednagar Sultanate army, like those of the other Deccan Sultanates in the Mughal Empire, welcomed European recruits, many of whom, like Perez, became renegade converts to Islam. These soldiers, assigned in the Deccan armies to divisions called the Farangian, or foreign troops, were reputed for their prowess as artillerymen. But there were other non-military opportunities available to European migrants who chose to leave Goa. In the 1590s, Fernão Rodrigues Caldeira, a so-called new Christian, which is to say a member of a Portuguese Jewish family forced to convert to Christianity, yet still practicing Judaism in secret, quit Goa to serve as an advisor to Muhammad Quli Qutb Shah, the Sultan of Golconda. Caldera was possibly just one of a number of migrants who came to Goa less as colonists than as covert religious refugees, escaping not just the Inquisition in the Iberian Peninsula, but also persecution in northern Protestant countries such as England and Holland. Habituated to underground lives in the countries they'd escaped, and therefore comfortable at a safe distance from European religious and political authority, these refugees often forged stronger ties with local peoples, languages and customs than did other Portuguese. In the 17th century, the fledgling English East India Company, that was set up in 1600, also sent many people to the subcontinent via the same sea route as the Portuguese. Upon arrival, these migrants found themselves in far more precarious positions than the white Mughals of later centuries. The first English factory at Surat, where Minucci disembarked with his master in January 1656, was hardly an economic powerhouse. And this is a picture here of the Dutch factory at Surat. As you can tell, it's rather small, but the Dutch factory was considered the glory of the foreign factories in India at this time. It was a tiny little thing. The English factory was far tinier. No pictures of it survived because it was so insignificant. It barely merited attention. So to get a posting with the English East India Company at this time was not exactly a desirable career option. The company employees, many of them poor, operated in miserable conditions. Drunkenness and disease prevailed. The levels of mortality were astonishingly high. It was, if not a death sentence, to be sent to India to work in the East India Company factory, then you were playing a version of Russian roulette. The temptation for East India Company employees to move elsewhere in India to richer and healthier zones outside the limited reach of company authority was immense. Indeed, the two bandits Minucci encountered en route to Agra had probably succumbed to this temptation. Several other people who arrived from England via the sea route didn't linger in Surat or the company factories, but moved to Mughal-ruled areas where they assumed local clothes, customs, tongues, and even religions. But they didn't become white Mughals in Dalrymple's sense, as there wasn't yet a colonial English political or administrative system that could grant them high offices. Instead, their trajectories were altogether humbler. Take the example of Gilbert Harrison, or Gil, as I'll call him. You can tell I'm kind of invested in this guy. When I first encountered mention of him in the record, I couldn't help but narcissistically misread his name every time I came across it as Gil Harris. So, all right. So Gil Harrison worked for some years at the tiny East India Company factory in Thatta, a river port city in what is now the Pakistani province of Sindh. The factory had been set up in 1635 as a meagerly staffed outpost of the company's calico trade. By the way, that's not the factory. But it may have looked a little bit like that. Again, the working conditions there were wretched. There were only 3 people based there. And again, the usual excesses of alcohol and disease seem to have prevailed there. On the 16th of August, 1647, Gil died of a fever. The surviving letter concerning his burial arrangements suggests that prior to his death, he'd become something rather different from what we might expect of a company employee. This letter notes that he'd requested a colleague to give his Hindustani clothes and his dagger to his Indian servant. He'd also asked to be interred in the chief burial place of Nasirpur, as the Nasirpur chief men wanted him to lie there sepulized, which means buried. So these 2 stray remarks hint that Harrison had become at least partly Indian. He'd taken to wearing Indian clothes, an embrace of local culture not always followed by Englishmen in 17th century India. For example, the English ambassador to India, to Jahangir's court from 1615-1619, Sir Thomas Roe, insisted that all his retinue remain clothed in English taffeta, which was a rather taxing assignment in the 45-degree summer heat of Ajmer. Many of them just keeled over and died of heat exhaustion. So it made good sense to start wearing Indian clothes, but not many English people did it. The Swadesi-clad Harrison had also become intimate enough with his servant to make him the sole heir of his decidedly humble estate, his Hindustani clothes and his dagger. Was theirs a simple domestic arrangement, or were they closer? And was this relationship one reason for Harrison's transformation? Harrison's burial site suggests he'd made other unconventional choices. First, he'd relocated from Thatta to the small town of Nasirpur, more than 100 kilometers to the north, up the river Indus. We don't know if the move was prompted by East India Company business, but the English didn't have a factory in Nasirpur. It was instead the base of the Rizvi Saids, an influential Sufi. Gil Harrison was obviously known to the family. That the town's chief men, including one assumes members of the Rizvi Saids, wanted him secularized or buried in its chief burial ground, indicates that he was no longer a Christian, at least not outwardly, as a Christian couldn't possibly find a resting place in what was almost certainly a Muslim cemetery. Had Harrison converted to Islam? We can't recover all the details of Gil Harrison's last years, but it does seem as if his journey from Thatta to Nasirpur took him much further afield than just the geographical distance between the two towns. So, what does it mean to become an Indian before the time of the white Mughals? To answer that question means challenging ideas of racial identity that are the legacy of centuries of British colonialism. Of course, there are limits to bodily transformation. We can't grow a third leg or a second heart. But our obsession with epidermal colour as the basis of an irreducible identity, be it white, black, brown, overlooks how much our bodies are constantly changing as our environments change. Moving from a cold to a hot climate changes our body's diurnal rhythms, leading many of us to nap during the hottest afternoon hours and stay up late to save the cooler hours of the night. For the English, this is scandalous. Napping during the day, that gets in the way of God-fearing productivity. Sweating more means we crave saltier food to replenish electrolytes lost through dehydration. Eating the cuisine of a different country changes not just our taste buds, but also how our bodies smell. Absorbing a new terrain's distinctive germs alters our bodily functions and our immune systems. Treating our bodies for local diseases means ingesting new plants, spices, or minerals that transform our chemical and indeed even our mental composition. Speaking a new language necessitates using our tongues, our lips, our facial muscles, even our hands, in completely new ways. Performing the gestures or wearing the clothes appropriate to a foreign religious or cultural community demands that we use our bodies differently. Moving repeatedly through a new landscape or cityscape necessitates transforming our skills, training our bodies to acquire new proficiencies within the physical limitations imposed by the space. Now, before the age of British colonialism, bodily transformation was rarely, if ever, about adapting to a new environment so that it may be more effectively dominated or ruled. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the demand to transform one's body was both more pressing and more mundane. It was often simply a matter of survival. Travel to India in pre-colonial times meant adjusting, at least for Europeans, to dangerous new environments where one's life was potentially at risk from extreme climates, deadly diseases, and human as well as animal predators. The challenge of survival necessitated comprehensive work on the body. Just as an actor or an athlete has to train her muscle memory to perform new tasks, so did the new migrants have to retrain and transform their bodies to cope with the demands of their new locations. It's no coincidence that the word travel derives from travail, a French word meaning work. We may associate travel now with Club Med, relaxation and recreation, but in pre-colonial times, travel was always travail. It was work, work on the body as much as with the body. One might add that the work of becoming Indian didn't necessarily amount to going native, a concept that dates to the high water mark of the colonial age. And I've noticed in a lot of the blurbs that have appeared about my talk that I'm describing the phenomenon of Europeans who've gone native. In fact, I'm not doing that because I think going native is a highly suspect concept. It presumes an advanced identity replaced by an inferior one, a cultural degeneration from a European norm. By contrast, becoming Indian in pre-colonial times didn't assume any such degeneration, nor did it complete a clean transition from one identity to another. The idea of going native presumes that one has completely given up the advantages, the gifts of being European, and degenerated into a state of reprobate barbarity. No, to become Indian entailed something altogether more open-ended, messy, and provisional. Those who became Indian may have transformed their bodies, consciously or unconsciously, in response to their new environments. But they couldn't entirely shed the tendencies and the habits of their previous lives. How could they? This often resulted in a volatile mix of bodily aptitudes. It also meant, as the careers of Roach and Simmett, the two bandits with which I started, suggest that the cultural loyalties of those who became Indian weren't always predictable. They may have served Indian masters, but their sense of home was often complex and bifurcated. So how do we recover the stories of these migrants and their complex bodies? Traditional archival research can only reveal so much. As the case of Roach and Simmett demonstrates, the historical record is just tantalizingly elusive. We can scan official records of the East India Company, the Portuguese Estado de India, and the Mughal court for fleeting references to foreigners who became Indian, but we won't find many. We can read the few autobiographical accounts like Minucci's of migrants' lives, but again, they're very few. So many details have vanished, and most migrants have left only the faintest trace of a trace, if any, in the historical record. Now this is hardly surprising given that many of these migrants were illiterate. And even when they weren't, it was only very rarely that they or the people they met thought to document their experiences. But there was another archive available to me as I tried to recover the experiences of Roach, Simmett, and their peers. My own body. For in many ways, I was interested less in the precise chronological details of the migrants' lives, when exactly they did what. On Monday they ate this, on Tuesday they visited this person, than their biographies in that word's most literal sense. Biography is derived from the Greek bios and graphane. Bios meaning body, graphane meaning to write or imprint. So a biography is not just a writing of a body, it's also an imprinting of a body. And the body is not an unchanging unit that can be known simply by its colour or its geographical origin. Indeed, we shouldn't speak of the body, but of bodies plural. As we've seen, bodies are changeable nodes within larger ecologies, which is to say, bodies interact with and are transformed by a variety of elements, environmental conditions, including the climate, the landscape, whether geological or human-made, cultural imperatives that direct bodies to act in certain ways and not others, and the large ensemble of transformative matter that we take into our bodies: food, drink, medicines, germs. We are not just what we eat, we're also what we come into contagious contact with. And beyond all these factors, perhaps more intangible, but no less real for that, is what historians have traditionally called political economy. the larger relations of production, of work, of labour, both local and global, that shape our actions and direct our movements, allowing some bodies more or less privileges, more or less possibilities than others. As this might suggest, one doesn't just write bodies. Bodies are more accurately written upon, inasmuch as they're imprinted and transformed by all these external elements. The tales of migrants who became Indian are biographies in this much more literal sense. My body's experiences in India have helped me plot these elusive biographies. I first visited India in 2001. I've returned each year, and since 2011 I've lived here more or less permanently. Watching the ways in which my own body has adapted to the weather, diseases, landscapes, foodstuffs of India might not have allowed me to recover in precise detail the diverse experiences of my predecessors. After all, my body is different from theirs. And the particular India to which I've adapted is urban, middle class, mostly Anglophone, and largely air-conditioned. Thank goodness it's not over-air-conditioned tonight. Therefore, westernized in its climatic as well as its linguistic preferences. My India is a world away from the Indias plural in which poor 16th and 17th century migrants settled. But my body's experiences in India have taught me something about the lives of these earlier migrants. My body has repeatedly alerted me to the fact the dislocations of migration aren't simply mental or emotional or cultural. Ever since my first visit to India, my body has increasingly felt like it's not my own at all, at least not in the sense of being entirely within my control. It's been felled by food poisoning in Delhi, sunstroke in Chennai, viral fever in Kolkata. It's tripped and broken its big toe on a stray route in the deer park of Horsecast. It's been pushed and shoved by pickpockets in the throng at Moinuddin Chishti's Dargah in Ajmer. Yet these disabling experiences have also been matched by the acquisition of new competencies fitted to my body's new environment. My body has developed a tolerance, even a craving for mirchi. It's perfected the art of the head wax. It's adapted sufficiently well to the heat and humidity of the north that it can now, for the first time, run a half marathon in Delhi. To understand what it means to become Indian demands attending to the agonies and ecstasies of the migrant body's transformative encounters with new environments. And indeed, ecstasy is a really useful word in this context. It derives from the Greek ek, stasis, meaning standing outside oneself. Now, we might be inclined to regard ecstasy simply as an emotional or a spiritual state, but in its Greek usage, it's also an embodied condition. Standing outside oneself is a delightful paradox. It means having a body that is no longer one's own body, or rather, it means finding one's body transformed as it enters into a new mode of being in the world. This ecstatic condition is also a recognizably Indian one. The Sufi concept of the mast, a person overcome with love for God, refers not simply to a religious or spiritual ideal. It more precisely describes someone who's surrendered to and been transformed by an overpowering bodily intoxication. We all know that intoxication can be pleasurable. We also know it can be poisonous. In either case, it turns the body into something other than it was. Sufis distinguish between the mast, who is a masjid, possessed by a largely interior state of spiritual exaltation, and a salik, in touch with outward surroundings. It's the intoxicating touch of the salik's outward surroundings that most transforms the body. Rather than a solipsistic exercise in navel-gazing then, looking at my own body's diverse experiences in India has provided me with an ecstatic point of entry into the environments and historical processes that have differently transformed Roach, Sinnott, and me, as well as the many other migrants to the subcontinent. What it means to become Indian before the heyday of British colonialism also demands that we rethink the very ideas of India and the Indian. Just as I'm skeptical of the notion of the body, so am I skeptical of the notion of the Indian. Of course, during the 16th and 17th centuries, there was no single political entity called India. This is another version of the map that we looked at before, but it's even more stark here. How the subcontinent, what we would now call India, was divided very differently. It was divided up amongst a diverse collection of empires, sultanates, kingdoms, tribal zones, and smaller colonial dominions. These territories weren't culturally, linguistic, or religiously homogeneous, just as they are now. They differed within themselves as much as from each other. Nor were they uniform in terrain or climate. So to become Indian in the 16th and 17th centuries was not to become one monolithic thing, like suddenly receiving an Indian passport. Hooray, you become Indian, well done. Do your head waggle for us. One became varied on the basis of one's ecological as much as cultural and economic location. To become Indian in the coconut-rich hinterland of Goa meant something quite different from what it meant in the typhoon-drenched, mosquito and tiger-dominated terrain of the Sundarbans, or in the relatively arid hills of the Deccan Plateau. Likewise, to become Indian in the fakir-congested gullies of Ajmer meant something quite different from what it meant in the luxurious Havelis of Agra, or in the enormous Mughal harem of Lahore. Each location prompted different bodily transformations. For all their diversity, however, these locations did have one thing in common. To lesser and greater extents, and for different reasons, each were multicultural spaces in which foreign migrants could find new homes. In addition to installing Central Asians and Arabs as courtiers and retaining mercenary soldiers from Europe, the Mughals also welcomed Christian traders, artisans and priests into their main cities, Agra, Lahore, Delhi, Ajmer. The Deccan sultanates were ruled by Persian and Turkish elites, who likewise invited foreign merchants, physicians and soldiers, including Africans or Habshis, into cities such as Aurangabad and Hyderabad. Although Portuguese Goa was the first European colony in India and had imposed the Inquisition in 1565 to prosecute non-believers, it was temporarily a haven for various religious dissidents, Sephardic Jews, English Catholics from Europe. Other Portuguese-speaking zones outside the official Estado de India, such as the pirate communities of the Sundarbans, brought together Bengalis, Europeans, and Burmese Arakans. And as Amitav Ghosh has shown in his absolutely sublime book, In an Antique Land, the Malabar coast of South India may have been the most cosmopolitan zone of all, with cities like Cochin, Kollam, and Calicut providing homes to Arab, Jewish, and Chinese merchants. Each of these different multicultural spaces asked migrants to cultivate distinctive new bodily skills and habits. Which is to say, these spaces not only offered migrants new homes, they also functioned as engines of bodily transformation. The foreigners who joined them altered their bodies in ways I've already discussed, by eating Indian food, wearing Indian clothes, succumbing to Indian illnesses, learning Indian languages. But just as importantly, their bodies were also transformed by the acquisition of new skills specific to these spaces. Those migrants who joined troops of mercenary soldiers, such as Roach and Simmet, often brought with them some knowledge of how to handle firearms, which was a new yet devastatingly effective technology introduced to the subcontinent around this time. Yet these migrants who became mercenaries also had to master new bodily techniques, handling scimitars, riding horses, enduring military maneuvers in the heat, moving efficiently through intimidating terrain such as the rocky highlands of the Deccan or the parched deserts of Rajasthan. The freebooting pirates of the Sundarbans in Kerala, such as the Chinese sailor Chin Ali, who joined a rogue Malabari navy, may have developed sea legs in the countries of their birth, but in their new subcontinental locations, they also had to adapt their bodily reflexes to constant rain, the predations of mosquitoes, and the possibility of attack by snakes and wild animals. Foreigners who joined communities of itinerants in Ajmer or Delhi, and there were quite a few of them, begging in the streets of Ajmer and Delhi, They had to train their bodies to perform rituals of prostration and to be satisfied with a meager diet, usually of rice, dal, khichdi. They also had to endure extremes of weather and little or no clothing. Migrant medical practitioners often took unfamiliar body-altering and sometimes mind-altering drugs. There's a great episode involving a Portuguese top doctor who tried bhang for the first time, which is perhaps the first scientific record of the phenomenon that people call the munchies. Discovered bhang makes you hungry. And foreign women who lived in harems, such as the Armenian Bibi Juliana Farangi, were expected to acquire an ensemble of new bodily techniques, dancing, singing, human chess piece playing, even weapon bearing, depending on their rank and vocation. These migrants were foreign, yet not foreign. They came from elsewhere, yet they and their bodies became Indian. At times, their liminal status could be a source of discomfort and alienation for them, in locations where the prevailing religious cultures, especially caste Hinduism, value purity of body and belief. Yet it could also be a spur to extraordinary creativity. A surprising number of migrants engaged in innovative thought experiments, scientific, literary, architectural, artisanal, theatrical, spiritual, political, historical, that couldn't have happened anywhere but in India, that couldn't have been produced by anyone but a migrant. Here's a short list. The underground Sephardic Jewish physician Garcia de Orta, personal doctor to the Sultan of Ahmadnagar, wrote a revolutionary treatise on tropical medicine based on his knowledge of Western Arabic medicine and his dialogues with local hakims. In fact, he said repeatedly that local doctors know much more than the doctors back in Europe about how to treat Indian diseases. The dissident English Catholic priest Thomas Stevens, also known as Patri Guru, wrote an 11,000 stanza Marathi poem, the Krista Purana, that was recited by freedom fighter Marathas, Goans and Malabaris well into the 20th century. The Ethiopian slave turned soldier, regent and urban planner Malik Ambar designed and built the multicultural city that was to become Aurangabad, and he also installed a fully functioning water system through aqueducts that survives to this day. The Delhi Municipal Corporation could learn a thing or two from him. The Basque jeweler Augustin Iriard, known to the Mughals as Hunarmand, i.e. skillful, created the peacock throne and other ingenious devices at Agra, using a mixture of Hindustani and European techniques. The English fakir Thomas Coriax, that's not how he dressed, by the way, in his fakir period, was based in Ajmer, where he performed an oration to Jahangir, the Mughal emperor, in Farsi that was a blend of Persian, Rajasthani and English theatrical styles. The Armenian Jewish Sufi and yogi Sayyid Sarmad, who migrated to Karachi, Hyderabad and finally Delhi, wrote 321 Persian rubaiyat quatrains that amounted to a gloriously homoerotic manifesto for interfaith tolerance. The Portuguese salt trader turned pirate Sebastião Gonçalves Tibão forged a unique island kingdom in the Sundarbans called Sandwip that made fellows of European, Burmese and Bengali freebooters. And our old friend Niccolo Manucci, Roach and Simmett's victim, wrote a history of the Mughal emperors in Portuguese, Italian and French, overlaid with Persian and Urdu, drawing on indigenous chronicle and Western forms. All these migrants contributed to making India something more complex, something more globally connected than what we might usually understand by the term India. The foreign, not foreign status of the migrants I've discussed today is captured particularly well by the Indian word in my talk's title, the First Firangis. Since my first visit to India in 2001, I've become fascinated by this term. Its most common translation in English is foreigner, but that doesn't do justice to its subtle shades of meaning. Farangi is a broad synonym for the Hindi Videshi, alien, and paradesi, outsider. But these two Hindi words are also a world away, quite literally, from farangi, a Mughal-era Persian makeover of the Arabic word farangi, meaning Frank or Frenchman. It was first employed as a derogatory term for Christians in the wake of the Crusades. Many of the Crusaders were Frenchmen, Franks, and the Arabs created the term farangi to describe them. It spread through Persia to the Mughal and to the Deccan Sultanates. Farangi has been subsequently applied to white Europeans, Armenians, dark mixed blood Portuguese Indians. There are people living in Bangladesh with names like Da Costa, Perez, who are Bengalis, but are also called Farangis. There's a town just north of Chittagong called Farangi Bazaar, where many of them still live. The term Farangi was even applied to Africans before it was applied to the British, and now foreigners resident in India. Videshi and Paradesi are homegrown terms derived from Sanskrit. By contrast, the word Farangi is like what it describes, a migrant to India that has somehow become Indian. My former Hindi teacher in Washington, D.C. is a bit of a nut. She favors a chaste Sanskritized language purged of all supposedly alien interlopers, and she taught me a Hindi that I don't think anyone has ever spoken. When I came here speaking to it, over and over again, people would look at me with puzzled expressions and say, "Kya?" So, anyway, she grimaced whenever she heard the word Farangi. "Ye shabd kya hai?" she would ask. "Hindi nahi hai. Sahi shabd videshi hai." As this might suggest, she considers Farangi an impure term, a linguistic foreign body that has illegitimately become Indian. Yet Indian it undeniably is. Even today, as I flick through the pages of Filmfare, a major source of research for this project, I see a photo of the Bollywood actress Nargis Fakhri, accompanied by the caption, "True Farangi charm." The mixed language caption underlines how this foreign word that has become Indian is the perfect term for foreigners who have become Indian. Fakhri, of course, was born in America of mixed Pakistani and Czech heritage. The idea that something or someone foreign can become Indian is heretical to many, and you can guess who the most obvious suspects are. But it raises the question, what does it mean to be authentically Indian? For my teacher in Washington, D.C., the answer to that question is a loaded one. I suspect, well I don't suspect, I know that she objects to the word Farangi less because of its derogatory associations than because it came to India with the Mughals. In her view, the more Hindi can be made to approximate the Sanskrit, the pre-Muslim India, the more authentic it will be. Yet this conflation of the authentically Indian with a supposedly original Indian culture, and by implication with Hinduism, disavows the extent to which the subcontinent has always been a land of migrants, including the Hindus. In the words of former Indian Supreme Court Judge Markande Katju, India is a country mostly of immigrants who came to the country over the past 10,000 years. How many of you have seen Vicky Donor? You may have an image in your mind now of the doctor describing the trajectory of Alexander the Great. Katju presumably had in mind not just Alexander the Great, but the many ways of migration to the subcontinent through its northwest, which has added Turkic, Mongolian, Afghan, Persian, Arab, East African, Armenian, Jewish, and Greek DNA to India's exceptionally diverse genetic mix. And India's religious diversity is equally the product of migration. Many of Kerala's Christians are descended from Syrian migrants as far back as the 1st century. Most of Cochin's tiny, dwindling Jewish population is descended from Middle Eastern, Ottoman, Mesopotamian, and Iberian migrants. The formerly animist B'nai Menashe of Manipur and Mizoram are supposedly descended from Burmese migrants, though they also claim descent from the Manasseh, one of the lost Jewish tribes. India's Parsi community is descended from Zoroastrian Persian migrants in the 11th century. The Dawoodi Bohra Muslims of Gujarat claim descent from Yemeni migrants in the 16th century. Guan Yu worshipping Chinese migrated to Calcutta in the 18th century. And more recently, Tibetan Buddhists have settled in Himachal Pradesh, Delhi, and Karnataka. All these migrant descended communities are Indian, even if there are factions in India who would like us still to think of them as foreign. No matter how much their bodies may contain the genetic traces of other lands, over generations they've adapted to and been diversely transformed by the climates, the landscapes, the cultures, and the languages of India. In the face of such diversity, what can it mean to be authentically Indian, other than to be a migrant to India or the descendant of one? How, as a consequence, might the history of the farangi shed unexpected light on what it means to be authentically Indian? How might it allow us to recognize that the history of the subcontinent, despite the immense weight of tradition, despite the rigidities of Varna, despite the vituperations of Hindutva, is less one of pure origins than of multiple migrations, mixings, and adaptations, and bodily transformations? It's not just foreigners who transform their bodies, it's all of us every day who are transforming our bodies in response to the environments in which we're living. What if the authentically Indian named not a pure, but an impure condition? Indeed, what does it even mean to be authentically Indian, when the very word India itself is a Farangi invention, derived from the Greek name for a river in what is now Pakistan, the Indus, i.e. Sindhu, in Hindi and Sanskrit. As my talk's title suggests, I'm interested in fleshing out the histories of the first Firangis, and by that term I don't mean the first immigrants to India, but rather the first people to live in the Indian subcontinent under the name of Farangi. Which is to say, those migrants who came to Hindustan, the Konkan and Malabar coasts, the Deccan and Bengal during the first 2 centuries of the Mughal Empire. The first Mughal emperor, Babur, was himself a migrant, of course. He was from Andajan in what is now Uzbekistan, of mixed Turkic and Mongolian ancestry. Several generations of intermarriage with Hindu Rajputs helped his descendants refashion themselves as local. Jahangir was half Rajput, his son Shah Jahan, 3/4 Rajput. But of course, lest we think of the Rajputs as authentically Indian, the Rajputs themselves are descended from migrants, a nomadic Central Asian people known as the Ephthalites or White Huns. The Mughals, however, used the word Farangi not to refer to themselves, but to first-generation migrants from a wide variety of locations. And this is a common strategy, to disavow one's own impure genealogy by saying these other people are foreigners, we are the people of the soil. The migrants that the Mughals called Farangi weren't only Christians from Europe, as we've seen. Many were from elsewhere. Indeed, Farangi was a common surname for Mughal-era Armenians. The best known is a man named Abdul Hay Farangi, who was quite a prominent member of Akbar's court in the 1590s. The name was also occasionally used of Africans, which may seem completely counterintuitive to those of you who identify Farangi with people like me, with white faces. So one such African was a fellow named Juan de Santiago. He was enslaved and forcibly converted to Christianity as a youth by the Portuguese before being taken to Goa in the 1530s. After his master's death, Santiago fled Goa, reverted to Islam, the religion he'd been born into, and found service with Sultan Bahadur of Gujarat, from whom he received the new name of Farangi Khan, African. Farangi may often have been employed throughout Mughal Hindustan and the Deccan Sultanates as a term of disdain and even opprobrium. But it also designated special classes of people who fought or worked for Indian causes. The Farangian in the Deccan armies, who I've already mentioned. The Farangi surnamed Armenians who served in the Mughal court. The Farangi Khan, African, in the service of the Gujarati Sultan. Which is to say, the term Farangi possessed and still possesses an imprecision that the English word foreigner cannot quite communicate. But this imprecision is precisely what I love about the word and why I want to use it and own it. It can never mean simply British or Christian or white non-Indian, though it's often used that way. And it can never be simply derogatory, although it's again often used that way. In its history of diverse usages, the term evokes less a fixed identity of the kind presumed by our modern racial categories than a process of becoming something other than what one was, a process of transforming one's body in India, a process that is ongoing and open-ended. And that's why I consider myself a farangi, not a Videshi or a Pardesi. Thank you very much. Like the migrants I've considered here, I'm a foreigner, but I'm also not. My time in India has transformed me, changing how I speak, how I think, what I wear, what I eat, the music I listen to. The process may not always be deliberate or conscious. Indeed, at times, it might even be unwelcome. But slowly but surely, like the word farangi itself, main Hindustani ban raha hoon. More importantly, studying the history of the word farangi can also help us understand how, at a time when the violence of 3 centuries of British colonialism was yet to happen, migrants to India didn't always come to the subcontinent in order to dominate it. It's impossible to disavow that later history. But we also need to think against and beyond it in order to imagine alternative, unexpected forms of cross-cultural contact in India and elsewhere. As a consequence, we might also begin to recognize how much of what we think of as authentically Indian, for instance, a beloved Marathi poem embraced by Indian freedom fighters, a 17th century Deccan city with a state-of-the-art water supply system, a legendary throne of Mughal emperors that has become a synonym for Indian power, the rubaiyat of a Delhi Sufi still revered by present-day Indian Muslims and Hindus. All of these are the product of transnational migrations and mixings. In all these cases, the authentically Indian is simultaneously the handiwork of farangi who've crossed borders and become something other than what they were. Minucci got it only half right. Roach and Sinnott weren't just English impostors. In their artful border crossings, which is to say in their refusal of any pure identity, they were also authentically Indian. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gil, for that very, very rich, wide-ranging and yet detailed talk. I'll just take 2 minutes, to lay out what I thought were the most exciting conceptual possibilities that Gil's work has opened up for us, and then we have about 20 minutes of discussion since we started 10 minutes late. The first, I think, is this simple historical thing that so many of us overlook, that the transaction between India and the rest of the world was never a transaction between the Indian and the English. That the world is a much bigger place than England, and that the whole range of migrants that Gil talked about, came from countries very far away, often from England, Italy, France. So that the range of cultural influences that came into India is much, much larger than merely English. The second, which sort of flows from the first, is that this diversity enables us to break a method that's become pretty deeply entrenched in many of us, and that's what we might describe as the rigid post-colonial binaries. One of the things that Gil shows is that the transaction was far more not only varied but worked in both directions. And I think the word Firangi in some senses pulls together both these impulses. On the one hand, a transaction with Europe which is far larger than a transaction with merely England, and on the other hand, farangi as a category which just cannot be contained by a simple binary opposition between the Indian and the European. Finally, of course, one of the things that Gil opens up as a methodology even is to think of the body as an archive, to think of the possibility of recovering that which is written on the body. That as a source of knowledge, that is a source of research, is a really interesting methodological possibility, and you know, so there's a lot of things that Gil has opened up, and you know, let's have questions.
Professor Harris, my name is Chandra Mohan. I was teacher of
a contact zone of some form. There's no such thing as a pure culture that doesn't have a mixed genealogy, some kind of contact with the outside. Even Japan, in the centuries that it was completely closed off. At the same time, I want to speak up for the specificity of what's happened here, precisely because of the present moment in which we're speaking now. As you could probably tell, even as I was attempting to recover lost histories from the medieval Mughal period, I'm doing so precisely to question some of the assumptions about India in the present that I think are of pressing political importance to question.
Excuse me, I'm Rahul Jagat. I'm a friend of Raj Mohan and Rizio. You have brought out that most of the Firangis, as you would call it, were ready to shed their clothes and get into the Indianness, pure Indianness, what you call. Now, you as a Firangi, why do you think in today's India, we are not ready to do that? Today, the same Indian is not ready to shed his clothes if he's a Marathi guy. The same Keralite is not ready to shed his Keralite image. The same Tamilian is not ready to shed his Tamilian image. The same Northeastern is not ready to shed his Northeastern image, and others are not ready to accept it. Is it insecurity? Is it pride? Or is it a fear? Whereas what you have brought out is that every Indian, anybody who came to India was ready to adapt to something what was going to come. So one question is that, and second question, and sorry for taking it, why is India the most romanticized migration story?
Why don't I answer some of this quickly instead? The first question I'm not going to answer, or at least not directly, because I'm not in the business of making generalizations about different peoples from India. All I would say is that I think it has been a politically effective strategy to encourage people to believe that their identities are pure, sacrosanct, and have to be defined in opposition to others against whose contaminating contact they must protect themselves. But that is not an intrinsic part of the culture necessarily. It's often something that's been politically foisted from people. In terms of the romanticization of India, there are many people who've written about this who can answer this better than I can. But so many people live in India. So many people have come to India. So many people have migrated here, even though the dominant historical narratives might have given us a rather skewed understanding of that migration. India is a place that has an enormous number of connections to the rest of the world. Not just in the age of shining India, or 69 rupees to the dollar India, but for centuries, largely because of the accident of its geographical location. India is at so many crossroads that it is, geopolitically speaking, a squid with an infinite number of tentacles pointing in so many different directions. Romanticization, I think, is simply the lubricant of that squid's connections to the rest of the world. Question.
Okay, so
Yeah, I've lived here 6 out of the last 8 years, and I don't expect that I would ever have a reason to go back. So I really appreciate that you look backwards and look at the diversity and the sort of how identity was different in the 16th, 17th century. And I think it's important to recognize that that was true in many parts of the world, and that, you know, what does it mean to be English at that time, or Italian before there was Italy, and German before there was Germany. So asking the question about India is a really interesting question too, because was there really an India? I think more than that, though, looking, now I'm going to wear my American hat, in the Americas, there were many more Englishmen who went to live with the Native Americans willingly than there were, and that wasn't a romantic thing, that was because they had a better life, than there were that came the other way, right? So I have a question, and it's kind of, I think it's one I'm really wrestling with. There were also Africans before, slavery, before slavery there really wasn't racism in the way we understand it, right? I mean, color didn't mean the same thing. Which is something Americans forget all the time. They think if race was, but unfortunately, there was this thing that was called slavery in America, and as a result, in my country, race still matters. And I don't, we have a black president, but I don't see that we're going to stop, shooting young black men and locking them up for a long time to come. And so my question about this is okay, here we didn't have slavery in the same way. We had colonialism, and colonialism matters, and I wonder sort of like, I really think that it's important to look back and say, wow, this has historically been one of the most open societies that has ever existed in the world. I mean, I'm married to a Catholic Christian who was a Christian before the English were Christians, and you can go all that. But the thing is, what does it mean? I mean, what does colonialism do to you guys like us? Do you know what I mean? Not to us. I mean, I don't mean to say we get treated really pretty well, right? You know that, but I mean, what does it do to our identity? I mean, I don't know. Can we escape that? Is that possible?
Very quickly, I don't think we can entirely escape it, but that doesn't mean that we give up critiquing certain notions of identity that were historically created and foisted on us. It's interesting that you refer to the American context, because I think in America there's a certain type of identity politics that is very much the product of the history of slavery and well-intentioned attempts to combat the consequence of that history. Yet, nonetheless, a certain form of identity politics slots straight back into the conceptions of identity that were the product of slavery themselves, slavery itself. So I think another footnote I'd add is that Americans don't own slavery. Slavery was a global phenomenon, and in fact it happened here. And this is something that a lot of Indians are happy to outsource to America. But there was a long history of Indian Ocean human trade, in particular between Ethiopia and East Africa and India. Ethiopian kings were desperate for Indian silk, and the way in which they bought the silk in bulk was to sell people from the non-Christian parts of Ethiopia to various merchants and traders coming from India. So slavery, there is an interesting and ugly history of slavery here too. It hasn't had quite the same effects because it played out differently historically. But I think that it is crucial, even as we can't completely escape, certainly not in a day, the legacy of history, that we continue to speak back to it. As Marx says, we are free. We are free to make choices, but not in conditions of our own making. And we've inherited a world in which certain realities are on the ground, but we can still push back against them.
Good evening, sir. So you've spoken about the colonial approach towards history and going backwards and studying it that way, and also the Mughal histories of it. So I want to ask you that apart from these, have there been any other alternative histories which have been explored? Because these have been the two predominant ways of studying history, right? Even in textbooks and things like that, we do have a very colonial and Mughal perspective. Are there any alternative histories which have been approached with similar themes?
Well, in India there is a very influential movement called the Subaltern Studies movement. which operates outside the dominant narratives of history. It's been, to a certain extent, a victim of its own success, even as it's attempted to retrieve these heterodox, non-official histories. There's a way in which in the West, subaltern has weirdly become a synonym for the Indian. In the West, subaltern studies has become Indian history, what we white colonials have neglected. And we need Indians to come over here to tell us the truth. There are equally subaltern histories in Europe and America and anywhere else in the world. And I'd like to see what I'm doing not as Mughal history or European history, but global subaltern history. So I'm operating both within certain constraints, disciplinary constraints of historians, many of whose work I admire, but at the same time I'm trying to chafe against it a bit. And the locus of this global subaltern history for me, as Sambudha very articulately pointed out, is the body. Or rather, bodies, because I resist the idea of the body. Bodies that are an archive of sorts inasmuch as they contain the traces of histories that are literally not written in script, but are written instead on the body.
I'll keep this very short. I was just wondering, you were talking about the derogatory sense in which the word farangi is used, but I just wanted to know your thoughts on the element of aspiration also in that term, because as opposed to what the gentleman here was saying, I have more than pride in, say, Indian dress or languages. I've encountered a sense of embarrassment with the Indian dress and languages. I don't know, that might be a small part of the population, but I'm just wondering what you feel about that sense of aspiration, because even when you say true Firangi charm of Nargis Fakhri or a Katrina Kaif, there is that sense of whatever desire or aspiration that's involved. So what do you feel about that?
Well, the best line in Dibakar Banerjee's film Shanghai was the slogan that was up on the wall of a development meeting at which a politician was saying Jai Pragati, but on the wall it said India Bana Pardes, as if this was something to aspire to, that India was becoming foreign. Actually, I think it is something to aspire to, but not in the way that is implied in that film. Inasmuch as I think we're all foreign in some way. But it's obviously the result of the West's enormous economic power globally. And power is seductive. So we want to be what they are, because they've got the power. So we want to dress up that way, we want to speak that way, we want to create music that sounds Western. This is why Hindi soundtracks are increasingly less and less Hindi soundtracks. They're sounding, Priyanka Chopra releases an R&B album, for goodness sake. I mean, all power to her, but it seems to be part of the same aspirational global American culture. That's middle-class urban Indians, but also not just middle-class Indians. More and more Indians are being interpolated into.
Thank you, Gil. One question. I was wondering, why there's a urgent need to resist fancy positions about what is India? How would the state, the modern Indian state, approach this question? Or rather, how would we take this responsibility within the context of Indian what do you think of that?
That's a difficult question because I'm not a politician and I'm not a policymaker. So I can't think of, nor would I want to advocate policies. What I would want to advocate for instead is a disposition, a critical and skeptical disposition with regards to claims that are made on behalf of Indianness. Who gets to be an authentic Indian and who not. And we're going to see a lot of that in the next few months, I suspect.
listening, when I was listening to your talk, I was thinking almost going on a mountaineering expedition where this change in diet and clothes and all that's happening. My question was, in this age of Farmville, you're on Facebook, there's no real muscle memory. There's no, I mean, there's this melting pot, but there's no melting. This process is not happening, so how does that come about?
That's a really nice question. I mean, there is muscle memory, it's just unconscious. I mean, we're getting used to sitting down. We're getting used to spending all our time doing this. We're getting used to having this attached to our hand all the time and just prancing out when we're in the presence of a screen. But this is part of a global culture of so-called connectivity that is designed actually to make us as unconnected as possible to the people who are, and to the conditions that are right next to us. I mean, so often I've come across people who are texting each other in the same room at a party. Now I'm running the risk of sounding like an insufferable old fogey, but the theoretical model that I've presented today presumes a certain kind of transformative power of adjacency. That what we come into physical contact with transforms us. Now, I don't think the new world of social media stops that. But what it creates is a phantasm of connectivity without touch. We have touch phones that we touch in order to get in touch with people who are simply specters or phantasms far away. And so we spend our lives believing that we're in touch with the things that in fact we're not in touch with. And we are out of touch with what we are touching right now. So what I'd hope this talk might also point towards is the necessity of a certain kind of mindfulness about one's body in the moment, in the present, and not simply in a Buddhist sense or a generic Buddhist sense, but a political sense. The world we're in right now, and the fact that it's important to remain in touch, not just that way.
Yeah, but Gil, you know, the really good thing that comes out of that question is that, I mean, one of the things that's happening is sort of globalized and standardized muscle memory, taking away the specificity of the body, sort of adapting itself, becoming different as it moves across regions.
That's absolutely right. I mean, globalization.
I'm going to be slightly contrarian and ask, where does one go from here? Having laid out this methodology, if one takes it up and actually tries to do solid historical research, are enough materials available? Just taking up the issue of the body, can one actually go and dig up graves and do DNA genetic analysis? The controversy around St. Francis Xavier in Goa still continues. And also in terms of the way, while you're framing this quite clearly pressurized by certain formulations of the present, there are also other ways in which the present tries to reclaim the past, which are not always amenable to such utopian visions. I'm thinking of Father Stephen. I'm from Maharashtra. I made a valiant attempt once upon a time to read all the 11,000 verses in Marathi and gave up. But the debate about whether he was, for example, inspired by the Marathi saint poet Ganeshwar and the praise of Marathi that he has in the initial verses, whether it goes back to that, in what script should the Krishna Purana be propagated, whether it should be the Roman script or the Nagari script of Marathi. So, in spite of the hopefulness with which you are laying out these issues, I unfortunately remain a bit skeptical about where one can go from there, and your comments will be welcome.
I think skepticism is always the best response. If there is a utopian element in what I'm talking about, it's not because I believe that we can retrieve the past and make it the blueprint for the present. Utopia means not only a good place, but also no place. And so what's utopian about my talk in some ways conforms more to that. Because the past here is a no place. We can't live in it. In terms of doing history, I think your phrasing was revealing. You spoke about solid history. What I'm doing is not solid history, nor can it be, nor would I even want it to be. I'm operating in a very different phase transition than solidity. What's here is liquid, it's even gaseous. I'm dealing with vapor, with ripples in the archive. When I talk about the body as an archive, I'm not talking about it as a solid archive. I'm talking about it more as a point of entry into speculation. So that's why I was very careful to point out that my body is not their body. My India is not their Indias, plural. But I can use the experiences of my body to question some of the certainties that we have navigated by, as we have told these sort of larger grand narratives about contact between cultures. Often I think it is as small an ambition as it may seem to be. It's enough to say things haven't always been this way, nor need they be. That's what I'm trying to do now. I'm not advocating a return to a time when Jesuit English priests, dissidents from England, travelled out to Goa and learned Marathi and became poets and published their 11,000 long, stanza-long poems in Roman rather than Devanagari script. Apparently Stevens was very upset about the fact that it was published in Roman script. He wanted the Goan authorities to produce Devanagari typeface, but they said, no, it's going to be too hard. I'm not advocating a return to that because we can't reproduce the conditions in which Thomas Stevens, Patri Guru, operated in Goa. But we can sort of use the glimpse of something other than, at right angles to what we assume to be the truth, assume to be wrongly the timeless condition of identity, foreigner versus Indian, to unsettle the way in which we think about that world, about the world. I'm not advocating a political agenda here. I'm not, as I said, a policy maker, but I'm a critic. And as a critic, I feel it's my responsibility to critique. Other people can pick up the mess that I've left and make of that what they will.